She sat in a middle seat, reading a cheap paperback, wearing an old hoodie. Nobody looked at her twice. Then two F-22 fighter jets showed up beside a dying airplane, and saluted her. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly who she really was. Stay till the end. Before we get into how we got here, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Gate 22 at Denver International Airport smelled like burnt coffee and jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of clear, high-altitude blue sky that Colorado does better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Business travelers hunched over laptops. A toddler shrieked with laughter somewhere near the window. Nobody paid any attention to the woman sitting alone near Gate 22C, a paperback novel open on her lap, a small gray duffel bag tucked between her sneakers. She looked, by any ordinary measure, unremarkable. Late 40s, maybe 50. Faded jeans. A plain navy pullover with a small coffee stain near the cuff that had never quite come out in the wash. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, more gray than she probably would have liked. No jewelry except a thin silver watch. She wasn't scrolling her phone like everyone else. She was reading, an actual paperback, the spine cracked from use, the cover showing a lighthouse against a stormy sea. When boarding began, she waited for her group to be called, stood without hurrying, and shuffled onto the jet bridge with the rest of the economy passengers. She found seat 27C, a middle seat, third from the back, about as far from first class as a person could get on a Boeing 777, and settled in without complaint. A businessman in a gray suit took the aisle seat beside her. He glanced at her once, the way people glance at furniture, and immediately opened his laptop and started typing. He didn't say hello. He didn't need to. In his mind, there was nothing about the woman in 27C worth a second look. He had no idea he was sitting next to Colonel Sarah Whitfield, United States Air Force, retired. Sarah Whitfield had spent 22 years in a cockpit. She'd flown F-16 Fighting Falcons over 2 continents, led a squadron through combat deployments that never made the evening news, and retired 18 months ago as one of the most decorated fighter pilots of her generation, though almost nobody outside the Air Force would have recognized her name. That was by design, mostly. Some of what she'd done during her career was still classified. Some of it she simply never talked about because talking about it meant reliving it, and she had made peace, mostly, with leaving certain memories where they belonged, behind her. Retirement had been harder than she expected. 22 years of urgency, of being needed, of having exactly one job and doing it better than almost anyone alive, and then, suddenly, quiet. She'd tried a desk job with a defense contractor. She'd lasted 4 months. She'd tried volunteering at a veteran center, which she still did on Thursdays, but it wasn't the same as being the person other people's lives depended on. Today she was flying to Baltimore to see her sister, whose youngest daughter was getting married in a few days. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Sit in the middle seat. Read her book. Land, hug her sister, cry a little at the wedding, fly home. She had chosen the middle seat on purpose. Middle seats were cheaper, and more importantly, nobody talked to the person in the middle seat. Nobody looked twice. After a career spent being watched, evaluated, and depended upon by hundreds of people at a time, there was something almost peaceful about being invisible. The businessman beside her, his name, she would later learn, was Craig Donnelly, a regional sales director for a medical device company, spent the first 20 minutes of the flight on a phone call he probably shouldn't have made once boarding closed, using words like synergy and leverage in ways that made her wince internally, though her face never changed. When the flight attendant asked him to end the call for takeoff, he sighed audibly, as if being asked to follow basic safety procedure was a personal inconvenience visited upon him specifically. 2 rows ahead, a mother struggled to calm a toddler while her husband stared blankly at the seatback screen, either exhausted or simply checked out. Behind them, a group of college students traveling together laughed too loudly about something on someone's phone. It was, in every visible way, an entirely ordinary flight. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 2:47 p.m., taxied for 12 minutes, and lifted off runway 16R at 3:04 p.m., climbing out over the Rockies into clear afternoon air. Nobody on board that flight, not Craig Donnelly beside her, not the exhausted parents, not the flight attendants moving through their pre-service checklist, had the slightest idea that the woman in seat 27C had once talked a wingman through a mid-air fuel emergency at 18,000 feet with calm precision that later became a case study at the Air Force Weapons School. They didn't know her hands had once guided a battle-damaged aircraft home on instinct alone when half her instruments had gone dark. They didn't know anything about her at all, because she had never given them a reason to. That was about to change. If you had asked Sarah Whitfield, at any point during that flight, to describe herself in a single sentence, she would not have mentioned rank, medals, or flight hours. She would have said she was a woman going to see her sister get her youngest married off, carrying a paperback she'd bought at an airport bookstore in Ramstein, Germany, 11 years earlier and never finished, because life kept interrupting her at the same chapter. She had grown up in a small town outside Lubbock, Texas, the daughter of a crop duster pilot who used to let her sit on his lap and hold the yoke of his old Piper when she was 6 years old, long before anyone had explained to her that this wasn't something girls were supposed to want to do for a living. She'd enlisted in the Air Force Academy at 18 with a stubbornness that her instructors alternately admired and found exhausting, graduated in the top of her class, and spent the better part of the next 2 decades proving, over and over, in cockpits and briefing rooms and promotion boards, that she belonged exactly where she'd put herself. She had commanded a squadron. She had lost people under her command, 2 pilots, in 2 separate incidents years apart, and she still thought about both of them more often than she let anyone know. She had flown missions that would never appear in any public record, over territory she was not permitted to discuss even now, years after retiring. She had earned a chest full of ribbons she rarely wore and a reputation, within a very small and very specific community of people, as someone whose calm under pressure was almost unnatural. None of that showed on the outside. That was, in its way, the whole point of who she had become. A fighter pilot's job, more than anything else, is to be the last steady thing in the room when everything else is falling apart, and steady, real steady, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a uniform in the airport. It sits quietly in a middle seat with a paperback novel, waiting for a flight to Baltimore, asking nothing of anyone. Her ex-husband, a fellow officer she'd met at flight school and divorced amicably 12 years later when their careers pulled them in different directions, used to joke that she was the calmest person he'd ever met right up until the exact moment she needed to be terrifying, and then she simply was, without any transition in between. It wasn't a joke, not really. It was just true. She thought about none of this as she boarded Flight 1847 that Tuesday afternoon. She thought about her sister's face when she'd see her at arrivals, and about whether she'd remembered to pack the blue dress for the rehearsal dinner, and about whether the lighthouse in her paperback was going to survive the storm on page 200 and something, which was as far as she'd gotten before her life, once again, found a way to interrupt her at exactly the wrong chapter. 41 minutes into the flight, cruising at 36,000 feet somewhere over western Nebraska, Sarah felt it before she heard it. A shudder. Small. Almost nothing. The kind of vibration most passengers would never notice, would dismiss as ordinary turbulence if they noticed it at all. But Sarah's body had spent 2 decades learning the difference between an aircraft behaving normally and an aircraft telling you something was wrong, and every cell in her had gone on alert before her conscious mind had even finished the thought. She set her book down, not folding the corner, not marking her page. Some part of her already understood she would not be picking it back up any time soon. 10 seconds later, it happened again. Stronger this time. A metallic shudder that ran through the airframe and up through the floor and into the soles of her feet. Overhead, the seatbelt light chimed on. A woman 2 rows back gasped. Craig Donnelly looked up from his laptop, irritated rather than afraid. Just turbulence, he muttered, more to himself than to her. It wasn't turbulence. Sarah had felt turbulence 1,000 times, in aircraft far smaller and far less forgiving than a wide-body jet at cruise altitude, and this had a different signature entirely, a rhythmic, mechanical wrongness, like something inside the airframe fighting against itself. The public address system crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We're showing an indication with our number 2 engine and are working through our checklist. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. An indication. The corporate word for something has gone wrong, and we are not going to tell you exactly how wrong. Sarah's eyes went instinctively to the window across the aisle, 3 seats away. She couldn't see the engine from her position, but she didn't need to. She had already begun doing what 22 years of training had made automatic, cataloging the aircraft's behavior, cross-referencing it against everything she knew about large twin-engine jets, building a mental model of what was actually happening 36,000 feet above the Nebraska plains. The shudder came a third time, longer, accompanied by a sound that made several passengers cry out, a deep metallic groan followed by a faint smell, acrid and electrical, drifting faintly through the cabin air. The aircraft yawed, almost imperceptibly, a subtle sideways drift that most passengers would never consciously register but that told Sarah everything she needed to know, asymmetric thrust. One engine was no longer producing power the way it should. The pilots up front were almost certainly already fighting to keep the aircraft flying straight and level, feeding in rudder trim to compensate, running through their emergency checklists with the practiced calm that airline training instills, but this felt, to her trained ear, like something bigger than a simple flameout. The flight attendants, to their credit, moved through the cabin with visible composure, though Sarah could see the tightness in their faces, the careful, over-articulated calm of people trained to project confidence they might not entirely feel. A young flight attendant, his name tag read Devon, made his way down the aisle, checking seatbelts, offering reassurance in a voice that cracked slightly on the second syllable of every sentence. When he reached row 27, Sarah caught his eye and spoke quietly, her voice low enough that only he and Craig could hear. "I need to speak with the captain." Devon blinked. "Ma'am, I understand you're concerned, but we need everyone to remain." "I'm not concerned," she said, and something in the flatness of her tone made him stop mid-sentence. "I'm a retired Air Force colonel. 22 years flying fighters. I need you to tell the captain that you have a passenger aboard with combat emergency experience, and I need you to tell him now, not after you've finished your walk-through." Devon hesitated for exactly 1 second, the length of time it takes a 26-year-old flight attendant to decide whether the calm, unblinking woman in seat 27C is telling the truth. Something about her eyes decided it for him. "I'll radio the flight deck," he said, and moved quickly toward the forward galley. Craig Donnelly, beside her, had gone very still. "Wait," he said. You flew fighter jets." 22 years, she said, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on the cabin ahead, reading the behavior of the aircraft the way other people read a book. "I thought you were just," he stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but they both knew how it ended. "I thought you were just some lady in a middle seat." The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, and somewhere behind them, a child began to cry. The intercom crackled 2 minutes later. "Would the passenger who spoke with our flight attendant please make her way forward?" Craig unbuckled without being asked and stood to let her out, something in his posture entirely different now from the man who had sighed about ending a phone call 40 minutes earlier. Sarah moved up the aisle with the unhurried, economical stride of someone who had walked toward emergencies her entire adult life. Passengers watched her pass, sensing without understanding that something in the ordinary texture of the flight had shifted. At the cockpit door, a flight attendant let her through into a space thick with tension and the low, insistent chime of a caution alert. Captain Marcus Reyes, 53 years old, 26 years with the airline, sat in the left seat with his jaw tight, working through a checklist with First Officer Elena Cho beside him. Both of them turned as Sarah stepped through the door. "Colonel," Reyes said, his eyes flicking briefly over her jeans and faded pullover before settling on her face, on something steadier there that made him decide to trust her. "We've lost significant thrust on engine 2 and we're seeing a hydraulic pressure fluctuation we don't love. We've got it contained for now, but I won't lie to you, this isn't routine. Show me, Sarah said. She leaned over the center console, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with the fluent, automatic speed of someone reading a language she had spoken every day of her working life. The hydraulic pressure gauge for the affected system was oscillating erratically, dipping low enough with each pulse to explain the shudders the passengers had felt. "You've got debris ingestion," she said after a few seconds. "Something came apart inside that engine and it's put a nick in a hydraulic line running along the wing root. It's not a clean break. If it was, you'd have already lost that system completely. It's an intermittent leak, which means it's going to get worse the longer you fly on it, not better." Cho glanced sideways at Reyes. "That matches what maintenance control is telling us over data link." "Your call, Captain," Sarah said. "I'm not here to fly your airplane. I'm here because I've made emergency decisions under exactly this kind of pressure more times than I can count, and sometimes it helps to have someone in the room who isn't feeling the fear firsthand. What's your plan?" Reyes exhaled. "Diverting to Denver. Emergency services are already being notified. We're 40 minutes out." "Then here's what I'd watch for," Sarah said, and for the next several minutes she walked them through it, the failure cascade she expected if the hydraulic leak worsened, the specific control inputs that would feel wrong but were correct if certain systems degraded further, the way asymmetric thrust compounds under load during a descent and how to anticipate it before it happened rather than reacting after. She spoke the way she had once briefed young pilots half her age before dangerous missions, without drama, without excess words, every sentence built for exactly the purpose of keeping someone alive. Reyes listened to every word. 26 years of commercial flying had taught him more about airline procedure than any fighter pilot would ever need to know, but nothing in that experience had prepared him for a genuine, physical, mechanical emergency of this kind, and he knew it, and he was wise enough not to pretend otherwise. "Would you consider staying up here for the descent?" he asked. "Not flying. Just, another set of eyes that's seen worse than this." "I'd be honored, Captain," Sarah said, and buckled into the observer's seat behind them. Denver Center picked up the emergency squawk within seconds of Reyes declaring it. Air traffic controllers began clearing airspace, vectoring other traffic away, coordinating with Denver International's emergency response teams already rolling equipment toward the runway. And then, unprompted, something else appeared on the radar returns near the aircraft's position, two fast-moving contacts closing from the northwest. "Denver Center, be advised," came a new voice over the emergency frequency, crisp and controlled. "This is Havoc Flight of 2, F-22s out of Buckley, currently on a routine training sortie. We have the emergency traffic in sight and are requesting to escort at your discretion." It wasn't standard procedure exactly, but it wasn't unheard of either, fighter aircraft in the area sometimes providing visual confirmation and support for airliners in distress, an old aviation courtesy as much as a tactical one. Denver Center approved the request, and within 90 seconds, two F-22 Raptors slid into formation off the airliner's wingtips, close enough that passengers pressing their faces to the windows could see the pilots' helmets turned toward them. In the cockpit, Reyes glanced sideways. "Colonel, want to say hello to your people?" Sarah allowed herself something close to a smile and keyed the auxiliary radio. "Havoc Flight, this is a passenger aboard the aircraft you're escorting, retired Air Force, fighters, 22 years. Appreciate the company." There was a pause, the particular pause of two young pilots processing an unexpected transmission, followed by a reply that carried an unmistakable note of respect. "Copy that, ma'am. What's your call sign, if you don't mind us asking?" She hesitated for the first time since the emergency began. It had been a long time since anyone had asked her that question and meant it. "Widow," she said finally. "F-16s. 2 combat tours." Another pause, longer this time. "Then, ma'am, it's an honor. We'll get you and this aircraft home safe." The descent that followed was, by any measure, one of the more delicate pieces of flying Reyes and Cho would ever perform. The hydraulic leak worsened exactly as Sarah had predicted, the pressure gauge sagging lower with every mile, forcing Cho to compensate with manual trim inputs that Sarah talked her through in a calm, unbroken voice. Ease it, don't fight it, let the aircraft tell you what it needs. The same words, almost exactly, that she had once used to talk a young lieutenant through landing a battle-damaged jet on a runway half the length it needed. Below and to either side, the two F-22s held steady formation, their presence a silent, visible reassurance to the passengers who by now understood, in the way passengers always eventually understand, that something serious was happening, even if they didn't know the details. At 11,000 feet, on final vector into Denver, the hydraulic pressure stabilized just enough. Reyes and Cho flew the approach with careful, deliberate control inputs, exactly as Sarah had coached them, compensating for a system that no longer responded quite the way it was designed to. The landing, when it came, was hard but controlled, tires screeching against the runway, emergency vehicles already rolling alongside before the aircraft had even come to a full stop, foam trucks positioned and ready though never needed. The aircraft rolled to a stop with its nose still pointed dead center on the runway, exactly where it belonged. For a long moment, nobody in the cockpit spoke. Then Reyes let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire flight and turned to look at Sarah. "Colonel," he said, "I don't know what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything, Captain," she said. "You flew a beautiful approach under conditions most pilots never train for. That was you and your first officer. I just talked." As the aircraft taxied clear of the runway toward the gate where emergency crews waited, the two F-22s that had escorted them down peeled away and climbed, circling back for a low, slow pass off the airliner's right side, close enough that the roar of their engines rattled the cabin windows. And then, without warning, both fighters rolled, smooth, deliberate, wingtip over wingtip in perfect unison, a maneuver every passenger with a window seat would remember for the rest of their lives, though almost none of them understood what it meant. In the cockpit, Reyes understood immediately, and so did Sarah. It was an old gesture, rarely performed and never performed casually, a salute rendered from one pilot to another, the kind of honor fighter aviators reserve for exactly the sort of thing that had just happened at 36,000 feet over Nebraska. Sarah watched through the cockpit window, her jaw tight, and said nothing at all. The evacuation, when it finally came at the gate, was calm and orderly, no chutes needed, no injuries, no drama beyond what the passengers had already lived through in the air. Emergency crews checked the aircraft. Paramedics checked the passengers, mostly for nerves rather than injury. News vans were already gathering outside the terminal by the time Sarah made her way down the jet bridge, her gray duffel bag over one shoulder, her paperback still tucked inside it, unfinished. Craig Donnelly found her near the gate area 20 minutes later, his suit jacket rumpled, his phone finally put away. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I sat next to you for 40 minutes and didn't say a single word to you. I looked at you and decided you weren't worth talking to." "You looked at a woman reading a paperback in a middle seat," Sarah said. "That's not a character flaw. That's just what people do." "It is a character flaw," he said quietly. "I know it is." She studied him for a moment, the careful suit, the expensive watch, the exhaustion now visible underneath all of it. "Then go home and hug whoever's waiting for you," she said. "That's worth more than an apology to a stranger." He nodded, and walked away, and didn't look back. Reporters caught up with Sarah near the baggage claim less than an hour later, having pieced together enough of the story from other passengers' phone videos and breathless social media posts to know that something extraordinary had happened in that cockpit. She gave them almost nothing, a single short statement, delivered the way she delivered everything, without embellishment. "I flew fighters for 22 years, she said. Today I was a passenger who happened to know a few things that were useful. Captain Reyes and First Officer Cho flew that aircraft down safely under conditions that would have tested any pilot. They're the ones who deserve your attention, not me." It wasn't enough to satisfy the cameras, but it was all she gave them, and within a day the story had spread anyway, the videos of the two F-22s rolling off the wingtip, grainy and shaky and utterly unmistakable, viewed millions of times by people who would never know her name unless she chose to give it to them. Captain Reyes called her personally that evening, after the airline's internal investigation team had finished their first round of interviews. "Maintenance pulled the engine apart this afternoon," he said. "Fan blade fatigue crack, exactly the kind of thing that doesn't show up on a routine inspection until it decides to let go all at once. You called it before we had a single piece of hard data. I've flown for 26 years and I've never seen anyone read an airplane the way you read that one." "You didn't need me to read it," Sarah said. "You needed someone in the room who wasn't afraid, so you and Elena could focus on flying instead of fearing. That's a different skill than the one you're crediting me for." "Call it what you want," Reyes said. "Elena wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to her sometime. Not for the airline. Just, pilot to pilot." "Tell her to call me," Sarah said. "Anytime." The airline, for its part, wanted to give her something: a commendation, a public thank you, a seat at some ceremony with cameras and a podium and her name printed on a plaque. She declined all of it as gently as she knew how, in a phone call with a very earnest young woman from corporate communications who seemed genuinely confused by the refusal. "Most people want the recognition," the woman said. "I spent 22 years doing my job specifically so other people wouldn't have to know my name," Sarah said. "I'm not going to start needing that now." The one thing she did accept, 3 weeks later, was a short, handwritten letter that arrived at her sister's house in Baltimore, forwarded from her home address in Colorado. It was from Elena Cho, and it was 4 sentences long. It said that she had gone home that night and called her mother for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, and that she had signed up to start instrument training toward her instructor rating the following month, something she'd been putting off for 2 years out of a fear she hadn't been able to name until the day the fear had a face and the face had been calm. She said thank you, twice, once for the flying and once for something harder to put into words. Sarah kept the letter in the same duffel bag she'd carried onto Flight 1847, folded into the back pages of the paperback novel, next to a chapter about a lighthouse and a storm she still, somehow, hadn't finished. She flew to Baltimore 2 days later, on a different airline, in an aisle seat this time. Her sister hugged her at the gate and cried, having seen the news footage and recognized her sister's coat in someone's blurry cell phone video before Sarah had even called to explain. "You could have told me you were flying today," her sister said. "You could have told me anything was happening." "It wasn't anything," Sarah said. "It was just a flight." Her sister looked at her for a long moment, the way people who love you sometimes look at you when they've finally understood something about you that had always been there, quietly, waiting to be seen. Then she laughed, half exasperated and half amazed, and pulled her into another hug. "Only you," she said, "would call that nothing." Sarah smiled, picked up her duffel bag, and let herself, just for a moment, feel it, not the fear of the flight, which had already begun to fade the way fear always does once the danger has passed, but something quieter underneath it. The particular, specific relief of being needed again, if only for 40 minutes, 36,000 feet above Nebraska, in a middle seat nobody had thought twice about. She didn't need the role, or the headlines, or the strangers who would recognize her face in airports for months afterward. She had spent a career being exactly what the moment required and then disappearing back into ordinary life, and if this was simply one more chapter of that same long story, she was, in the end, at peace with it. On the flight home the following week, she requested an aisle seat. She finished her book somewhere over Kansas, and it was, she decided, a satisfying ending.